Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing David Quinn's first season as head coach of the San Jose Sharks and evaluating how he did in this first look. Well, during the off-season of this season, the Sharks hired new general manager Mike Grier, and it was obvious that he would be taking a different look for the head coaching role instead of Bob Booner, who the Sharks had for a couple of years at that point. And he decides to bring in David Quinn, a longtime friend of his. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was just sort of nepotistically bringing in this rando coach because he happened to know him. David Quinn, of course, had NHL experience coaching an NHL team for a few years. That was the New York Rangers near the end of the 2010s. And while Quinn did not have much success with the New York Rangers, he wasn't also really set up for such, as the organization themselves announced that they would be rebuilding during the years that David Quinn was there. And once the Rangers were finally finished that rebuild and were ready to come out of it, they ended up letting go of David Quinn and bringing in somebody else. So he kind of got the short end of the stick in that situation. And the same may very well be happening with the San Jose Sharks, as once again David Quinn is indeed brought into a team that is not really expected to win games and is not really set up to win games either. David Quinn's biggest accomplishments with the New York Rangers were winning the draft lottery in 2019 and getting them the second overall pick, and then winning the draft lottery in 2020 and getting them the first overall pick. So if David Quinn can replicate those very same victories with the San Jose Sharks, I'm sure many fans will be very happy with how he's done. But besides all of that off-ice situation, let us discuss exactly what is going on the ice. And for the case of this video, we're going to be assuming that the Sharks are trying to win all of their games, trying to win as best as they can, and just seeing how David Quinn did with the cards that were indeed dealt to him. So let us first start off from an individual perspective here. And let us start off with some of the lineup choices that he made. Obviously, there will never be a coach who has lineup changes that every single fan of that team agrees with. It's just pretty much impossible to do for a couple of reasons. The first one, of course, being that fans work with pretty incomplete information. They can really only see what a player does on the ice, while a coach will obviously see what a player does on the ice, but also what he does off the ice, what he does in the weight room, what he does in the video room, and all of these things. So there are definitely times where players will get lowered ice time or potentially even benched based on things that they have done off the ice that a fan could not possibly know about. Having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean that the coach always happens to know what best, as we have seen time and time again players be benched or not really given the time of day by certain coaches, and then when they move on to a different coach or a different team, suddenly they blossom into a player that they very well could have been with that previous team. For instance, a good example this year doesn't necessarily happen with the San Jose Sharks, but instead with the Seattle Kraken, as Eli Tolvanen was a player with the Nashville Predators, never really given the time of day with that team, ends up getting waived at some point this season, being picked up by the Seattle Kraken, and once given that ice time, once given that opportunity, flourished very well with them. And in fact, Tolvanen just recently scored the Seattle Kraken's first ever playoff goal as a franchise just a couple of days ago, so that has worked out for him. So in terms of the lineup changes that I've disagreed with David Quinn on this season, primarily we have Kevin Labanc. First of all, his handling this season has been very strange, was a healthy scratch for multiple games. On top of that, he's also been more or less a glorified healthy scratch in multiple other games where he has indeed hit the ice and played minutes, but those minutes have been limited to fourth line minutes of like 6 or 7 of them. So it's just generally been a very weird handling of Kevin Labanc, who has actually had a generally pretty good season when he's been up with the first line, but for whatever reason has had the absolute shortest leash out of literally any other player on the San Jose Sharks. David Quinn, much more hard on him than any other potential player. And so generally, it felt as though just a singular bad game or a couple of bad games in a row would immediately land Kevin Labanc in the doghouse and get him either gone down to the fourth line with those very, very few minutes, or even as a healthy scratch, even with playing well. So that was definitely something I disagreed with on the handling of. The second would, of course, be Nick Bonino. Now, Nick Bonino in his time with the San Jose Sharks, maybe I've been a bit too hard on him. In the end, he was a pretty decent fourth line center as well as a pretty decent penalty killer. The major problem was when it came to the San Jose Sharks is that they used him as some sort of Swift's Army knife type of player, as though he could fill into literally any role on this team. Oh, we have a spot on the first line with Meyer and Hurdle. Well, how about we just put Nick Bonino as their winger? Oh, we have a spot on the first power play unit with Meyer, Couture, Hurdle, and Erik Karlsson. Let's put Nick Bonino in that situation. And it's just a bit of a weird move because Nick Bonino does not belong in those situations at all. And while the Sharks didn't necessarily have a ton of better options, the fact that I had to watch games in which Kevin Labanc sat on the sidelines or played 5 minutes while watching Nick Bonino hit close to 20 minutes of ice time is just a bit of an upside down world, because Kevin Labanc is significantly more skilled offensively than Nick Bonino, even if he's less responsible defensively. That doesn't really matter all that much when it comes to first line playing. So it was another weird choice. Another set of lineup changes that you could technically criticize Quinn for is the lack of younger players in the lineup, but I don't necessarily hold this against David Quinn, as it seemed much more of like an organizational choice from the San Jose Sharks as a whole. I don't know whether or not David Quinn would have liked to play players like Eklund or Bordelot in the lineup earlier on in this season, and that Mike Grier kind of nixed it. We'll never really know that situation. I mean, we could technically find out about it, but at this point we do not know, and so I can't necessarily fault Quinn for that. Later on in the season, we did see those younger players get those opportunities, and they were put in positions to succeed, but on the opposite side of things, we can't then say that, oh, clearly David Quinn is favoring these younger players and will give them sort of like these big opportunities to shine, because this was in the garbage time of the year, the last few games of the season, which did not matter. Once we see the beginning of next season, where we will have these younger players injected into the lineup more often than not, we will then see if David Quinn still puts them into these positions to succeed, while the Sharks, still have some playoff aspirations from game one of the regular season. Even if fans may think that the team should be rebuilding, David Quinn and the coaching staff will want to win as many games as possible. And will he still have Eklund playing 20 minutes a night on the first line in a situation like that? That does remain to be seen. So next year will really be the sort of the marker of whether or not David Quinn is going to be favoring these young players, or if he's much more of a sort of old school type of coach, going with the more reliable, I guess you could say, veteran type of players. Moving on from these lineup changes, we have more an individual look at how certain players have done under David Quinn compared to last season. Now, one of the big things with David Quinn when he was brought in from the New York Rangers is that he was much better with the defensive side of players compared to the offensive side of players. So, for instance, the Rangers, they had Adam Fox, and under David Quinn, Adam Fox ended up winning a James Norris Trophy for the best defenseman in the league. And generally, the defense under David Quinn flourished decently well for the Rangers. On the other hand, the forward side of things, especially on the younger players, did not have as much success. Like I mentioned earlier, the Rangers won the draft lottery with second overall in 2019 and with first overall in 2020, and picked up Kaapo Kakko and Alexis Lafreniere. And while we could put some blame, of course, on the players themselves, under David Quinn, neither of these two young stars actually managed to do all that well. And some will say that their development was kind of torpedoed by David Quinn being the coach at that time. So Adam Fox does exceptionally well as a defenseman, but Kaapo Kakko and Alexis Lafreniere not doing so well as forwards. Now, with the San Jose Sharks, that reputation kind of continued on the defensive side of things. Coming into this season, the Sharks essentially had Erik Karlsson leading the way, and then 5 traffic cones: Vlasic, Shemek, Megna, Ferraro, and Matt Benning recently signed. None of these players necessarily scream top 4 defensemen besides Erik Karlsson. All of them are kind of like bottom pairing at best. Shemek was a healthy scratch down the stretch last year, and deservedly so. Marc-Edouard Vlasic should have been a healthy scratch down the stretch last season, and only wasn't because of his name. Matt Benning has been just a career bottom pairing defenseman. Mario Ferraro, while has at times shown potential to be a better player, all of last season he was not good at all, so expected to maybe be bottom pairing at best. And then Jacob Megna has been okay with Erik Karlsson last year and showed decent chemistry, but on a better team wouldn't necessarily be given a top 4 spot. And in fact, we know exactly that to be the case because he was traded to the Seattle Kraken this season and currently is a healthy scratch for them. Did not even play in their game 1 of the playoffs this season. And yet, these defensemen definitely played better than expected. Of course, let us start with Erik Karlsson, who, as we know, has been over the past few seasons a player who has been frequently injured for the San Jose Sharks, but even when healthy and playing, hasn't necessarily looked all that fantastic. Has had some great games, few and far between, but nothing consistent, and yet this year was an absolute behemoth and juggernaut offensively for the San Jose Sharks. 101 points. Instead of the good games being few and far between, the bad games and invisible games were very few and far between. Erik Karlsson with multiple points in multiple games, 4-point games. I think he had like 5 of them this season, which is just absolutely absurd. Was the major reason for the San Jose Sharks having remotely any offense at even strength. If the Sharks' power play had been better, he probably could have had even more than 100 points, and yet that still ends up being only the 6th defenseman in NHL history to hit the 3-digit mark in terms of points. So an incredibly amazing turnaround season for Erik Karlsson. He had more points this year than his 3 previous years combined. And yes, you can give some credit to him finally playing a full 82-game season. But, at the beginning of last year, he also said that he was feeling very healthy and did not have this type of performance. And then when we look at some of the other defensemen, Matt Benning, fantastic in terms of exceeding expectations. He was expected, like I said, to be a bottom pairing defenseman and actually served as an okay top 4 defenseman at times for the San Jose Sharks this season, making up that shutdown pairing with Marc-Edouard Vlasic. So even though it was very up and down at times, where at times he's looked really terrible and at times he actually looked quite good, generally, I would say he was better than expected for sure. Marc-Edouard Vlasic likely looked the best he has ever since the 18-19 season, since the Sharks last made the playoffs. Vlasic actually looked like a pretty good top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks and probably their best defenseman when it comes to defensive play. Obviously, Karlsson leads the way in general play, but in terms of defensive play, Vlasic was quite good. Shemek, even in the games that he actually managed to play this season, also looked a good amount better than he did last year. In fact, the only defenseman who I thought kind of remained stagnant and the same was Mario Ferraro, who had an equally as disappointing season as last. And so the defense, there was those upticks in terms of play. They were handled quite well and played better than expected. Just looking at this defensive core, you're probably thinking this is going to be one of the worst defensive teams in the league. And while they certainly were in the lower half, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. On the other hand, the forwards, not so much. Timo Meier was already great last year and kind of just replicated that this year. Both Barabanov and Logan Couture saw increases in point totals, but I think a lot of that was just due to the fact of how dominant Erik Karlsson was at even strength and helped out in sort of increasing the point totals of some of the other forwards, as I don't think necessarily Barabanov or Couture were significantly better than they were in the previous year. And the one player who I was looking for some sort of change in was Tomas Hertl, who had all the pressure and sort of the monkey on his back last season with the contract situation and how he would end up as his future in the NHL. But I thought since all that was settled and coming in with a new coach, Tomas Hertl could potentially see that return to form, and yet it was more of the same from Hertl. There was no essential uptick in his actual play, and so generally top 4 forward, or the top 6 forwards, which is 4 of them, while there may have been some increases in point total, Timo Meier being, that very close to point per game player, Couture and Barabanov seeing that uptick, a lot of that was just due to Erik Karlsson, not so much due to them playing all that much better. So the defense, David Quinn did a great job with them, but on offense, not as much. But that is just with individual players. Now let's take a look at the actual systems themselves, and let us start off with the special teams here. As for the power play, the Sharks had an 18.4%, good for 25th in the league. I should probably say bad for 25th in the league, and a penalty killing percentage of 82.4, which gave them tied for 7th in the league. In terms of the power play, obviously not particularly good to be that 7th last, 25th in the league. this was a situation where it felt as though the Sharks, they kind of started off with a pretty bad plan. They felt as though a lot of the time they would keep things to the perimeter. They'd have like a up top Erik Karlsson, Timo Meier, Logan Couture, and their major strategy was just, hey, let's get the puck to Timo Meier and hope he takes an absolutely absurd shot and manages to score. And while that worked a decent amount of the times, it wasn't necessarily a recipe for success generally, especially since Timo Meier would end up getting traded to the New Jersey Devils near the latter part of this season. But it felt as though the Sharks were beginning to figure things out as time went on, and I liked more the adaptation that they did as the season wore on, which was to do what a lot of other teams do, is to get a particular player into the middle of the ice as that bumper slot to sort of relieve the pressure on the players on the outside. You're able to pass to that player, and while that usually doesn't seem like a fantastic idea because they're inside of the penalty killing box, and so you're thinking, oh, all four players can converge on that one player very, very easily. If that player is able to move the puck quite quickly, though this can be difficult at times, it does a very good job at making the outside players, the four outside players, have a easier time sort of finding those passing lanes and getting that space on the ice. And we saw, as I said, later on in the season, in particular with Jacob Peterson, who had this role, it helped the San Jose Sharks more often than not find those opportunities on the power play. So I think if the Sharks were to stick with an idea like this instead of what they were trying earlier on in the season with that sort of outside, let's hope our skill wins out type of situation, they'll have more success on the power play. When it comes to the penalty kill, generally the Sharks historically have been rather good on the penalty kill over the last few years. This year saw a small drop, but still rather strong. In particular, early on in the season, they were amazing, like 90% plus in like November and potentially even December. It kind of had a steady decline from there, but still 82.4% is quite solid, and 7th in the league is pretty good. Generally, the one thing that I noticed the difference between, or the couple things that I noticed the difference between David Quinn and Bob Booner's penalty killing is that it felt as though they were slightly less aggressive in their own zone in terms of actual penalty killing, but when it came to defending the entry on the penalty kill, as though defending their own blue line, I felt as though they were more aggressive in that type of situation, and it's probably one of the more aggressive Sharks penalty killing teams we have seen in a while when it comes to those zone entries. I felt as though in the past, the Sharks have been very, very easy and sort of just allowed teams to gain the zone quite simply and then try to defend it from there. But I like that this particular year, the Sharks penalty kill was more aggressive in defending that zone entry and showed some decent success because of that. When it comes to the actual 5-on-5 play here, this is where the San Jose Sharks kind of have that weird separation. There was an article that I saw earlier, it was about a week or two ago at this point, that the Sharks were lucky to have finished as low as they did in the standings, and that was sort of technically true. I won't necessarily say it was luck-based, but I would say that indeed statistically the Sharks appeared to be much better than they actually were, and as I mentioned in my season recap, the big reason for that was goaltending. The Sharks had absolutely terribly awful goaltending this season. If we take a look at their actual 5-on-5 stats, in terms of goals for, they had 168 goals for this season at 5-on-5, good for 20th in the league, and in terms of goals against, they had 220, which was third in the league, as in third highest, giving them a 5-on-5 goal differential of 52 or minus 52, which is indeed the worst in the league, not the worst in the league, but is quite bad. However, if we take a look at their expected goals for and expected goals against, it actually tells a bit of a different story. 188.55 expected goals for, that is 20 more than they actually scored, as well as 184.79 expected goals against, which is 35 or almost 36 less goals than they ended up giving up. And it should be noted that expected goals for and expected goals against are very imperfect stats. A lot of different websites will have a lot of different numbers for this because it's very difficult to actually get a strict sort of structure to evaluating these. Certain websites will have a breakaway given 0.8 expected goals, while other websites might have it as just 0.7, and of course certain players should have a higher expected goal total because if Connor McDavid gets a breakaway, it should be very high compared to if Noah Gregor gets a breakaway and things of this nature. But even though they are imperfect stats, they do still tell a decent story, and that story is that the San Jose Sharks should have had more goals than, or got more chances that would then they actually ended up in terms of goals and gave up less chances than they actually gave up in terms of goals against. In fact, their drop from the minus 52 goal differential of actual goals for and goals against to their almost +1 in terms of expected goals for and expected goals against is the largest in the entire league, basically to say that the Sharks got the unluckiest. Now, this isn't technically, like I said, luck-based, as if we also take a look at the other stat I have on this board, the high danger shooting percentage for the San Jose Sharks was 15.42%, only 27th in the league, and in terms of high danger save percentage, they were 79.8 or 42, which is 31st, or 8-2, which is 31st in the league, only above one other team. So indeed, they didn't really have that clutch factor in being able to finish off on their high danger opportunities, one of the worst teams in the league at that, and they didn't really have that clutch factor of saving the high danger opportunities, one of the worst teams in the league at that as well. And so generally, yes, the fact is that David Quinn has set up a system where the Sharks were generating chances, and yet the talent kind of let them out to dry. And they were also setting up a system where, indeed, in terms of expected goals for, they were not giving up a ton of chances, though indeed their expected goals for still ended up being 8th highest in the entire league, and yet their goaltending was letting them down. And so all of this to say, while the Sharks did indeed finish that 4th last in the league, and they were very, very close to even finishing just grand total last place, 32nd in the entire league, their statistics likely line them up more so for like a 9th place, a 10th place finish. Still not going to be a playoff team, but definitely a lot better than they actually showed, and probably more consistent with how they finished last year. And indeed, the Sharks, you could say, were lucky to have actually finished as low as they did, because it gives them much better chances of getting a very good pick in this upcoming NHL entry draft. So to conclude here, when it comes to David Quinn's first year, while there were some lineup changes that I disagreed with, and while I don't necessarily think he rejuvenized the forwards on this team as much as he did the defense, I would say all in all it was a pretty average and difficult to evaluate season from David Quinn, because again, like he was with the New York Rangers, he was kind of put into a situation to fail, and he sort of just had to make the best of a bad situation. I thought he did okay at that. Class dismissed.